We also need to make that point forcibly with the powers to be, to place us central in that response. And that we have to, there has to be an acknowledgement of the role that we as labor and community organizations play. And this is not something that the private sector can do. They can't do it because they don't have the resources. They can't do it because they don't have the institutional knowledge. And they can't do it because they don't have the same commitment. And when we see time and time again, whether it's in the United States or any other country around the world, that the people that are in fact responding are in fact the public servants that step forward.
When the storm hit, naturally our members do what they always do as first responders. They left their homes, many of them damaged like other people, and went to work and left their families behind, you know, in best shape as they could while they went out to restore electricity to all these people, millions of people that were without power. 1996 was New York where it was deregulated. There was the time it was deregulated in New York. And since then, the workforce had been cut to the bone, cut to the bone, cut to the bone. Maintenance had become a scam in maintaining the system. The utilities get the rates, right? And they get the rate increases from the Public Service Commission. And built into those rates is a certain amount of money to maintain the system. And Con Edison is not the only one, and many of them, I'd say almost all of them, do what they need. The system where they, once they get the money, they'll put some of the money into maintenance, but not everything that they get. So prior to the storm hit, well before the storm hit, the system was in a very bad state. If the storm, if the system had been hardened to the degree it should have been, there would have been a lot less people without lights. Now you can't prevent everything, you know, but when you have utility poles out there, dating back to the 1930s, right, in an area in the city of New York, is outrageous. So basically you have a third world utility operating within New York City. And they're getting first class you know, income from that. They get first class rates, of course. You have the CEO of Con Edison pulls in $17 million a year. Right? The head of the Port Authority, public entity, pulls in, I think, less than $300,000 a year. So you can see the difference here. You know, Kevin Burke, the CEO of Con Edison, makes more than, I think, all of the governors in the Northeast combined. So, you know, when it's profits ahead of people, this is what you get.
What I have seen and what we've seen in our union, you know, going back to September 11, was this cycle. A cycle that starts with a disaster, whether it's man-made or designed by nature in some way, is that the disaster is followed usually by a good public acting in the perception of public sector workers, followed by the vilification of the same workers, as if somehow they couldn't stand public perception to be so high. We saw that in 9/11, after the workers were being classified as heroes, and then followed by a doomsday budget that threatened to shut down city government. And then we go through this cycle and then say, well, we got to better prepare for the next disaster. And then the latest installment, this Superstorm Sandy, we see the repeat of the same drama, the same cycle. And so I wish I could stand here and talk about the fact that, you know, the story of those lab workers that work 14 hours a day to make sure that our water remained drinking water, or the EMS workers in Staten Island that worked in 4 feet of water to make sure that those services were being delivered. Or those 911 operators who worked 3 different shifts to make sure that those calls were answered. Or an eligibility specialist who volunteered in order to make sure those people who needed food got food stamps, all of which were our members. How do we break this vicious cycle? So, you know, I think one thing that we have to recognize is the fact that there's a fundamental difference between cost and value. That we, in this society, there are certain things that we value in this society that we see them as fundamental services that should remain in the hands of the people or government. And that value It's not an exercise on a budgetary line that says, well, do we need to look what is the cheapest service for the public through either an exercise of privatization. And I think that it's important for us as workers, as you know, union institutions, to start talking about that value. It is very critical that we not only recognize that value, but to understand and to explain to the public that the institutional knowledge of government, that the people that put together the system that maintain that rescue system that come to their homes, that respond to their calls, is not made by commissioners who leave every 3 or 4 years, or by elected officials who move on to the next elected line, but by those very same workers that show up to their homes and remind them that it's not just good enough to praise them when they show up at a time of a disaster, but praise them at a time where there is no disaster and there's a budget here and trying to cut the next line of workers.